All right, let's unpack this fascinating chapter on how culture shapes personality.
Okay.
You've given us a chunk of the personality puzzle,
Yeah,
and it's packed with research and ideas.
it really is.
Get ready for some aha moments about how where you're from influences who you are.
Definitely.
So right out of the gate,
Mm-hmm.
we're hit with this age-old debate. Is human nature basically the same everywhere?
Right.
Or do cultures create totally different people?
It's the fundamental question.
Yeah, and some anthropologists even say we can't even compare.
That's right.
Like it's apples and oranges.
Exact.
But the chapter digs into evidence for both sides.
Yeah.
So buckle up.
It's a fascinating right.
And they even give this example, as it's a Japanese term,
Oh, yeah.
amai,
Right.
which roughly translates to sweet dependence.
Mm-hmm.
It describes a specific kind of indulgent reliance between people
Right.
deeply ingrained in Japanese culture.
Yes.
But can we even apply that concept outside of Japan?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah, does it even hold the same meaning?
It's a real challenge to translate these culturally specific concepts.
It is.
And that's precisely why
Yeah.
cross-cultural psychology is so important.
I see.
It helps us understand these nuances, not just for academic curiosity, but for practical reasons, too.
Like what?
Well, imagine going to a new country
Okay.
and completely misinterpreting someone's behavior
Oh, yeah.
because you're viewing it through your own cultural lens.
Oh, the book is full of those cringeworthy examples.
Oh, tell me about it.
Like the American teenager in Singapore who got caned for vandalism.
Oh, yeah.
No, something that might be seen as a minor offense in one culture
Right.
can have serious consequences in another.
Absolutely.
It's crazy.
And,
Yeah.
beyond avoiding those awkward and
Yeah.
sometimes serious faux pas,
Yeah.
there's a bigger issue at play.
What's that?
The chapter points out that most psychological research is conducted on weird people.
Weird.
Weird.
Right.
It stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic.
Oh.
And the problem is
Yeah.
that's only a small sliver of the global population.
So basically, we're basing our understanding of personality
Yeah.
on a very limited sample of humanity.
That's the issue.
Okay, so before we go any further,
Sure.
let's define what we mean by culture.
Right.
It's not as simple as just nationality or ethnicity.
No, it's much broader than that.
So how does the chapter define it?
The chapter defines culture
Go ahead.
as any group of people who share psychological attributes.
Psychological attributes.
Yeah, this could include language, thinking styles,
Okay.
values, beliefs, and even behaviors.
Okay, so it's really about shared ways of thinking and being.
Exactly.
Think of it this way. You could have subcultures within a single city.
You absolutely could.
Like how the book mentions researchers
Yeah.
who found that U.S. cities actually vary in their strengths of the head versus strengths of the heart.
Yes, right.
For example, Boston
Yeah.
is apparently low on the heart scale,
Interesting.
meaning they're less focused on things like fairness, love, and gratitude.
Huh. Maybe that aligns with Boston's reputation for
Right.
being a bit more reserved.
Maybe.
Interesting.
But how do we even begin to compare cultures in a meaningful way?
Right.
The chapter introduces this concept of etics versus emics.
Okay.
What are those?
So etics are the universal components of an idea.
Okay.
For instance, every culture has some concept of duty, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
But how that duty plays out, those specific expressions within a culture, those are the emics.
So the ethic of duty might look very different in New Delhi compared to New York City.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But then how do we categorize all these cultural differences?
Right. It can feel overwhelming.
The chapter uses all sorts of dimensions to compare cultures, like versus easy, achievement versus affiliation,
Yeah.
and even tight versus loose.
Those are some of the big ones.
Yeah, what are those all about?
Well, take tough versus easy cultures, for example. In an easy culture, there are fewer goals that are considered important, and achieving them is generally perceived as less demanding.
So like a laid-back island life,
Exactly.
call it.
Contrast that with a culture,
Okay.
like a high-pressure urban environment where achieving goals is paramount,
Right.
and the path to success is seen as more challenging.
So that's tough versus easy.
Exactly.
Then there's achievement versus affiliation.
Right.
This one looks at whether a culture prioritizes individual success and accomplishment or harmonious relationships and social connections.
Exactly.
And the book even links this to a culture's economic growth,
That's right.
doesn't it?
Yeah, cultures that emphasize achievement
Yeah.
tend to see faster economic development.
Interesting.
But it's how these values are reflected in everyday life that's really interesting.
Give me an example.
Okay, think about children's stories.
Okay.
Do they emphasize getting ahead? Or do they focus on the importance of warm relationships? You know, those subtle messages can shape a person's worldview.
It's true.
And then you have tight versus loose cultures.
Right.
This one focuses on how much deviation from social norms is tolerated.
Okay.
The book says more diverse populations tend to create looser cultures where there's more flexibility in behavior.
Interesting.
They even mention this fascinating tidbit about left-handedness.
What's that?
Apparently, left-handed people are more common in looser cultures.
Oh, wow. Why is that?
The thinking is that stricter social norms, which are characteristic of tighter cultures, often go hand in hand with a preference for right-handedness.
Oh, I see.
So a higher prevalence of left-handedness could be an indicator of a more permissive or loose culture.
That is such a surprising link.
It is, isn't it?
But out of all these dimensions,
Yeah.
the one that really jumps out is collectivism versus individualism.
Right, that's the classic one.
It's the classic debate about whether the individual or the group is more important.
Absolutely.
And it impacts so many things,
Oh, yeah.
doesn't it?
It really does.
So how does that break down?
Well, the book emphasizes that collectivist cultures, often associated with East Asia, prioritize group harmony and interdependence.
Okay.
The self is less distinct, more integrated into the collective.
So in a collectivist culture,
Right.
fitting in and maintaining harmony are super important, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's less emphasis on standing out as a unique individual
Okay.
and more on fulfilling one's role within the group.
Got it.
However, the chapter cautions against oversimplifying this concept.
In what way?
Well, you know that stereotype of Asia equals collectivist.
Oh, yeah.
Especially when it comes to Japan.
Right.
Turns out, stereotypes can be powerful, even in research.
It's true.
A study mentioned in the book actually debunked the myth of Japanese collectivism being drastically different from American individualism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the idea of Japan being ultra-collectivist might stem from outdated observations.
Really?
And even wartime propaganda.
Wow, so much for stereotypes.
Yeah, always good to be reminded to be critical of those sweeping generalizations.
It is.
But how do these cultural dimensions actually play out when we try to assess personality?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Can we even use the same personality traits to describe people everywhere? That's the million-dollar question in cross-cultural psychology.
So what does the research say?
The research is mixed, but there's been a lot of work done using the big 5 personality traits across cultures.
The big 5, for those who don't know, are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
That's right.
And the chapter mentions studies that have mapped these traits across different countries.
They have. Yeah. For example, they saw that Mexico, Hungary, and Bulgaria score higher on extroversion, while Singapore, Japan, and Hong Kong score lower.
It makes you wonder how much of that is cultural influence versus individual differences.
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yes.
And, you know, even within a single nation, you can have distinct subcultures with varying personality profiles.
The book had another U.S. city example, didn't it?
It did. It highlighted a study.
What did they find?
That found 3 main personality clusters across U.S. cities.
Okay.
There's the friendly and conventional cluster, which is dominant in the Midwest.
Okay.
Then there's the relaxed and creative cluster, often associated with the West Coast.
Makes sense.
And finally, you have the temperamental and uninhibited cluster, prevalent in the Northeast.
So even within the U.S., there's regional variation.
Exactly. Geography might play a role as well.
That's so interesting.
Isn't it?
But it's not just about comparing traits across cultures, is it?
No, it's not.
The chapter also questions whether the same traits even apply universally.
Right.
Does it?
Well, some argue that directly translating personality tests across languages can be problematic.
I could see that.
And that certain traits, like openness to experience, might not have the same relevance in all cultures.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Not at all.
What's the alternative then?
There's a growing movement for developing personality scales within cultures rather than simply imposing Western concepts globally.
So a more tailored approach.
It's about taking a more nuanced approach.
That makes sense.
And then there's the question of thinking styles.
Right.
Does culture actually influence how we think?
Good question.
The chapter seems to suggest a resounding yes.
It does.
Yeah.
How so?
There's research suggesting that East Asians,
Okay.
for instance, are more holistic and contextual in their thinking, even when it comes to how they perceive themselves.
How that?
They see the individual as interconnected with their environment, whereas Western thinking tends to be more individualistic.
So an American might look at a picture and focus on the main subject, while someone from Japan might pay more attention to the background details and the relationships between all the elements.
That's a great illustration.
So different ways of seeing the world.
Exactly, and it extends beyond just visual perception.
Oh, wow.
It shapes how people view themselves and their place in the world.
It's all starting to connect now.
It is, isn't it?
But after all this talk about differences,
Yeah.
it's easy to forget that there are also universal human experiences.
Right, we're getting to the heart of it now.
The chapter ends by emphasizing how, regardless of culture, everyone experiences existence, work, relationships, and ultimately death.
It's a powerful reminder.
It is.
That we're all human, facing similar challenges and striving for connection.
Absolutely.
Even if we express it in different ways.
That's a valuable point.
It is.
Recognizing our shared humanity is crucial for fostering empathy and understanding across cultures.
Couldn't agree more.
But where do these differences come from in the first place?
That's what I want to know.
What shapes these cultural variations?
Yeah.
Should we take a break and then dig into those origins?
Let's do it. Let's explore that question of origins.
Yeah.
For a long time, some argued that cultural differences were simply subjective interpretations, impossible to explain in a concrete way.
Like they were just random.
Kind of, but this chapter highlights a more practical approach called the ecological approach.
What's that?
It suggests that cultures develop in response to their environments.
Their environments?
Yeah, like the challenges a society faces, the resources available, the climate.
So all these external factors.
Right, all of these factors can shape the way people think and behave, leading to distinct cultural patterns.
So different circumstances lead to different cultural adaptations.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
The book uses the example of ancient China,
Okay.
where the need for large-scale agricultural projects like irrigation systems may have fostered a more collectivist culture.
Because they needed to work together.
Right. Cooperation and prioritizing the group's needs would have been essential for survival.
That's interesting.
And the chapter contrasts that with individualistic cultures, like in the U.S., which might have developed due to the challenges of settling a vast new continent.
Right, that required a lot of self-reliance.
Exactly, and a focus on personal achievement.
It's like cultures evolve, shaped by the demands of their environment.
Exactly.
And it's not just about large-scale societal needs either.
Right.
The chapter even discusses how something as simple as the availability of fish can influence cultural differences.
That reminds me of the example of Truk in Tahiti.
Truk in Tahiti.
Yeah, in Truk, where fishing is dangerous and requires great skill and courage, the culture is more masculine and aggressive.
Oh, wow.
But in Tahiti, where fishing is relatively easy, men are described as more gentle and respectful of women.
So even something like how they get their food can influence the whole culture.
Exactly. Even subtle ecological factors can have a ripple effect on cultural norms and personality traits.
It's fascinating how interconnected everything is.
It really is.
But the physical environment isn't the only factor, is it?
No, it's not.
The chapter also delves into the impact of disease on cultural development.
Right. That's a really interesting angle.
It is.
The book highlights a study that found a correlation between cultures with a history of infectious disease and lower levels of extroversion, openness to experience, and sociosexuality.
So in cultures where disease was a constant threat, being more cautious and reserved might have been beneficial for survival.
That's the thinking.
Which would lead to those traits becoming more prevalent over time.
Precisely.
It's a thought-provoking idea.
Isn't it?
It suggests that even our personalities might be shaped, to some extent, by the challenges our ancestors faced.
Absolutely. We carry that history with us.
It really makes you think about the hidden forces that have shaped who we are today.
It's fascinating.
It is. But this whole discussion about ecological influences makes me wonder about the role of genetics.
Right. Nature versus nurture.
The chapter does acknowledge that genetic differences could play a role, right?
It does.
Even if they're not the primary driver of cultural variation.
Right. It's not a simple either-or situation.
Yeah, what does the chapter say about that?
It brings up a study that found cultural differences in interdependence, but only among individuals who shared a particular gene variant.
So it seems that genes might influence how susceptible we are to cultural influences.
Yeah, it's like our genes might make us more or less likely to adopt certain cultural norms.
Making this a complex interplay of nature and nurture.
Exactly. It's not easy to disentangle the two.
It's like a feedback loop.
Right.
Culture shapes personality, which in turn can influence the cultural environment.
And so on.
Right? It's a cycle.
It is, but the chapter also stresses the importance of avoiding oversimplification.
What do you mean?
Well, we can't assume that everyone within a culture is the same.
Right. There's always individual variation.
Exactly. There's a danger in assuming that everyone within a cultural group
Mm-hmm.
will exhibit the same traits or behaviors.
Like stereotyping.
Right. We should be cautious about stereotyping entire cultures based on broad trends.
It's important to remember that everyone is an individual.
Absolutely.
And speaking of stereotypes, the chapter also warns against the outgroup homogeneity bias.
That's a good one.
What is that exactly?
That's the tendency to see members of other groups as more alike than they actually are.
Oh, I see.
We often forget that everyone, regardless of their cultural background, has their own unique personality.
So it's like we're lumping people together.
Yeah, and it's a good reminder to approach each person as an individual, not simply as a representative of their culture.
That's so important.
It is.
But at the same time, we can't ignore the fact that cultural differences do exist.
Right.
And the chapter grapples with the thorny issue of judging those differences.
That's a tough one.
It is.
Specifically, it explores the idea of cultural relativism.
Cultural relativism?
Yeah, the idea that all cultural values are equally valid.
Okay.
But the chapter uses some pretty extreme examples.
Like what?
Like female genital mutilation.
Yeah, that's hard to reconcile.
Right, to illustrate the challenges of applying this concept in a real-world context.
It's a tough question.
It is.
While it's important to be sensitive to cultural differences, some practices simply cannot be condoned.
Right.
Even if they're rooted in tradition.
It's a complex ethical dilemma with no easy answers.
It really is.
But moving beyond the challenges of judging cultural practices, this whole conversation about culture and values make me wonder about people who belong to multiple cultures.
Oh, yeah.
How do they reconcile those different perspectives?
That's a great question.
Right.
The chapter touches on the concept of multiculturalism.
Okay.
Acknowledging that many people, especially in diverse societies, identify with more than one culture.
It's becoming more and more common.
It is.
And it can be an enriching experience, but also a challenging one.
In what way?
Well, navigating those different identities, values, and expectations can be complex.
It makes sense, though.
It does.
The book even suggests that bilingual individuals might have two personalities, in a sense.
Oh, yeah.
Because their personality test results can vary depending on the language they take the test in.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It's mind-blowing to think that we might shift our personalities depending on the cultural context we're in.
Like we're adapting to the situation.
But this whole idea of navigating multiple cultures sounds stressful.
It can be. The chapter addresses that as well.
Okay.
Introducing the concept of bicultural identity integration, or BI.
BI?
Yeah, people who score high on BI see their different cultural identities as compatible and integrated.
So they're comfortable with both.
Exactly, while those who score low experience more conflict and stress.
That makes sense.
So it's not just about being exposed to multiple cultures, but how well we can integrate them into a cohesive sense of self.
Like finding that balance.
Exactly, and it highlights the importance of finding ways to support multicultural individuals as they navigate these complex identity issues.
That's a good point.
That after all this talk about differences, the chapter ends on a note of unity.
It does.
Reminding us that despite cultural variations, there are fundamental aspects of the human experience that connect us all.
It circles back to that idea of shared humanity.
Right.
Like we were talking about earlier.
We all exist, we all work, we all have relationships, and we all face our own mortality.
It's a reminder that beneath the surface of cultural differences, we share a common human experience.
A powerful reminder.
It is a beautiful thought, really.
It is.
That even with all our differences, there's something that binds us together.
Absolutely.
It is a beautiful thought.
It really is.
It makes you realize that maybe we aren't as different as we sometimes perceive ourselves to be.
Right.
The chapter even suggests that seemingly distinct cultural behaviors might actually stem from similar underlying motivations.
That's a really interesting point.
Isn't it?
The book gives the example of how Chinese people are often perceived as less extroverted than Americans.
Okay.
But it could be that their culture simply encourages more restraint in expressing emotions.
So not that they're experiencing fewer of those emotions.
Exactly. It's about the outward expression.
So it's not necessarily that their personalities are fundamentally different,
right?
But rather that they have different cultural rules.
Yeah, like unspoken norms.
For how to express those personalities.
Precisely.
That's fascinating.
The chapter also discusses how some cultures interpret emotional experiences in more physical terms.
Okay.
For example, while an American might say they feel depressed,
yeah.
someone from a different culture might describe feeling discomfort in the heart.
So it's not that they're experiencing different emotions.
No.
But they might express them through different lenses.
Exactly. It highlights the fascinating connection between culture, language, and emotional experience.
It really does.
And, this idea of a shared humanity seems to extend beyond just emotions.
In what way?
Well, the chapter talks about how personal goals and aspirations can be surprisingly similar across cultures.
Oh, yeah. They mentioned a study comparing the personal projects.
Right. Of Canadian and Chinese students, didn't they?
They did, and the researchers were surprised. What did they find?
To find more similarities than differences.
Like what?
Regardless of culture, students were focused on things like getting good grades.
Okay, makes sense.
Finding a romantic partner, and even pursuing hobbies like quilting.
So basic human desires.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that we're all driven by similar desires for success, connection, and fulfillment.
No matter where we come from.
Precisely. It speaks to a certain universality in human nature.
It does. So after this deep dive into the chapter, what does it all mean for our listeners?
Man, I think the biggest takeaway is that culture shapes us in profound ways.
Okay.
But it doesn't erase our shared humanity.
We're all individuals, but we're also part of something bigger.
Exactly.
It's like we're all part of this intricate tapestry.
That's a great analogy.
Each thread unique, but woven together to create a beautiful and complex whole.
Well said.
Next time you encounter someone from a different background, remember, they see the world through a different lens.
Right. Their behaviors and expressions might be different.
Yeah.
But they're likely driven by many of the same basic needs and desires as you.
Keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
And who knows what fascinating discoveries await.
That's the beauty of it all.